They laughed louder than they listened. That's how it began. The ballroom shimmered in gold, with $1,000 suits and silk dresses, clinking glasses under warm chandeliers. It was one of those nights where power pretended to be polite, where elite comedians sharpened their knives not behind curtains, but on stage beneath lights. Stephen Colbert stepped up with a smirk that had become his signature, 1 part late-night host, 1 part moral judge, 2 parts cruelty, wrapped in clever punchlines. He barely took a breath before the first jab. They say Donald Trump couldn't make it tonight because he's allergic to books. Roaring laughter. Then another. Don't worry, he sent a cardboard cutout of himself. Same hair, less shouting. More laughter. But if you watched closely, way in the back behind the champagne towers, and the cameras panning left to right, you'd see him. Not on the list. Not introduced. Sitting still. Donald J. Trump. Alone. No entourage. No press team. No suit made to dazzle. Just a dark overcoat slightly wrinkled at the sleeve and a look in his eyes like a storm trying to behave. You wouldn't have noticed him unless you were looking for someone not laughing. And that's what stopped me cold, because I was watching live, and I thought he wouldn't show up. Not after everything they said. Not after the way they made him into a joke. But he did. He walked into the lion's den without roaring. He sat without asking for a spotlight. And when the cameras finally caught his face, Colbert turned like a shark sniffing blood. Oh, he did show up? Colbert grinned. Everyone please our national security risk in the flesh. The laughter this time wasn't just loud. It was mean. I don't know how you'd react, but for me, it hit hard. Not because I love everything Trump has done. Not because I'm blind to his flaws. But because that moment watching one man be treated like an object of scorn by a room of people who claim to care about dignity felt wrong in my gut. Like watching someone shove a veteran at a bus stop while quoting Gandhi. Trump didn't flinch, didn't crack, just sat there taking it. As if every insult had already passed through him 1,000 times before. But it was the silence after that made everything louder. Because once the applause faded, once Colbert wiped the tears from his eyes, someone in the audience leaned over and whispered not into a mic, but just loud enough to catch the boom. He should be used to it. That's what happens when you lose. And that right there was when I knew. This wasn't about jokes anymore. It wasn't about satire or comedy or truth to power. It was about humiliation. Targeted, rehearsed, and wrapped in the safe armor of a tuxedoed room that thought decency was a punchline you could dodge if you said it with a wink. Trump stood up. No one clapped. He didn't storm, didn't curse, didn't point. He just adjusted his jacket, stepped up to the podium, uninvited, and waited for the mic to be lowered. What he said, well, that comes later. But in that moment, before he even opened his mouth, before the room even processed the breach of decorum, I saw something I'll never forget. The quiet. That tight waiting silence when the villain doesn't rage, but reflects. And the people who painted him as a clown, they weren't laughing anymore. The microphone didn't welcome him. It wobbled as he adjusted it too high, then too low, until he found a middle ground not just for his voice, but for his presence. And when he finally stood still behind the podium, something about him looked unfinished. Like a man interrupted halfway through putting on his armor. No applause, no fanfare. Just the occasional shuffle of shoes on carpet and a polite cough that tried too hard to sound accidental. He scanned the room. Not with anger, not with pride. Just a long, steady glance that landed everywhere and nowhere at once. The kind of look you give when you're trying to remember why you came. In the third row, a CNN anchor stared back, smirking. In the back, a waitress whispered to a busboy, "That's really him!" And in the front, Stephen Colbert sat legs crossed, hand covering his mouth, as if stifling either a laugh or a line he didn't want to waste too early. Trump placed both hands flat on the podium. He didn't reach for his notes, he didn't bring any. He didn't lean forward to command the room, he didn't have to. He just stood there as if the silence itself would speak first. But it didn't. So he did. "I wasn't invited tonight," he said. A pause. But then again, I never really needed an invitation to walk into a room that already decided I didn't belong. A few nervous chuckles, mostly from interns who weren't sure if they were allowed to laugh. "But I came anyway," he continued, "because sometimes the only way to remind a room of what it's become is to sit in it quietly." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a man desperate for attention. This wasn't the caricature they'd sketched with such care for 7 years straight. This was someone who walked willingly into a space designed to reject him and refused to give them the performance they paid to see. He could have yelled. He could have cracked jokes of his own. He could have brought charts and stats and headlines from their own scandals. But he didn't. Instead, he told a story. "I remember being 16, he said. I was wearing a suit 2 sizes too big trying to sneak into a dinner like this one. Back then, the security guard didn't even ask my name, he just said, 'You're not the kind that gets to walk through this door.'" Trump looked down at his hands. And maybe he was right, but I walked in anyway, just like tonight. The room didn't soften. It hardened. Because stories are dangerous things when they're told by people you've decided don't get to be human. A woman near the side shook her head slowly, unimpressed. A man next to her whispered something, and they both smiled like middle school kids mocking a classmate behind a teacher's back. I've been in rooms like that. Maybe you have too. Rooms that smile politely while hoping you'll trip on your own shoelaces just so they don't have to dirty their hands pushing you down. And in that moment, Trump wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a former president. He wasn't even the center of attention. He was alone. More alone than I think most people realize. Because power doesn't protect you from contempt. In fact, sometimes it attracts it. That room didn't just want him out. It wanted him broken. But he didn't give them that. Instead, he did something that honestly caught me off guard. He talked about his father. Fred Trump wasn't a gentleman, he said. He didn't believe in excuses or apologies. But one thing he told me when I was a boy was this: if you ever find yourself surrounded by people who laugh louder than they listen, leave, or make them hear you without raising your voice. He let that quote hang there, long enough for it to echo in the space between clinking forks and rigid spines. You could see Colbert shift in his chair. Someone near the stage looked down at their program. No one laughed, and for the first time that night, I felt something flip. Not in the room, not in him, but in me, because I've been told to sit down when I stood up for myself. I've been talked over, brushed off, rolled past. And maybe you have too. And when I heard that line about making people hear you without shouting, I didn't think of Trump the politician. I thought of the 16-year-old in the oversized suit standing at a door that wouldn't open. And I wondered, how many of us never walked in? The thing about exclusion is it doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it shows up in the little things. The way someone glances at their phone the second you walk by. The polite silence that waits for you to stop talking. The missing name on a list they all pretend was a clerical error. Trump wasn't just not wanted there. He was strategically precisely not supposed to exist in that room. And everyone knew it, except one man, Ray Bartlett. He was old-school press. Wrote his columns on a typewriter until 2010. Covered Reagan, Bush, even Carter. And for some reason, no one ever fully explained he liked Trump. Didn't worship him, didn't excuse him, but respected the fact that Trump never played nice with the clubs that pretended to be neutral while picking sides in Champaign. Ray had mailed Trump a personal letter 2 weeks before the event. It read, "You were never meant to be on stage here. But maybe that's why you should be. No RSVP was ever sent." And yet Trump showed, not to prove a point, but maybe to be one. When he finished the story about his father, there wasn't applause. There was shifting discomfort. The kind that comes when someone brings something real into a room that survives on illusion. One woman at the Bloomberg table muttered, "He's just trying to sound noble now." A writer from The Atlantic rolled his eyes and whispered to his colleague, "I've read better monologues in student theater." The camera panned slowly over faces, many of which were stone cold. But just a few looked away. Not because they didn't care, but because part of them maybe recognized something they weren't ready to admit. I noticed one of them. Young man, mid-30s, clean haircut, expensive suit, trembling jaw. And in that moment I saw it. Shame. Because somewhere deep down he knew if you swap the name, change the suit, the man at that podium could have been him, or his father, or his neighbor. The kind of man these rooms rarely make space for, unless they come already polished and pre-approved. Trump shifted slightly and cleared his throat. Ray told me once he said that the loudest place in America is the silence in a media room when someone tells the truth you didn't write down first. It wasn't a jab. It was a confession. Colbert didn't move, didn't speak. His smirk had faded into something tighter, more calculated. You could almost hear the click of mental gears trying to find the next punchline, the next line that would break the moment and reclaim the narrative. But none came, because the room wasn't laughing anymore. Now you'd think maybe this was the turning point. Maybe the crowd would see the man differently. Maybe they'd reconsider the narrative. Maybe someone would stand up and say, "Let the man speak." But that's not what happened. What happened was crueler. They moved on. Someone called for dessert. A jazz trio began playing near the back, and the host stepped up, not Colbert, but the official MC, to say, "Thank you, Mr. Trump. We'll now return to our regularly scheduled program." No applause. Just return, like he'd been a technical hiccup, a bad frequency in an otherwise smooth transmission. Trump nodded, backed away, didn't speak again. And then just as he turned, it happened. A waiter bumped into him. Not by accident. It wasn't violent, it wasn't obvious, but the tray clipped Trump's shoulder just enough to send a small spill of coffee down the sleeve of his coat. The waiter didn't apologize. He just whispered, "Thought you liked it dark," and kept walking. And Trump, he looked down at his coat, took a breath, and smiled. Not the politician's smile, not the media smile, the kind of smile that says, "I see exactly what this is, and I'm still standing." I'll be honest, I stood up out of my chair, not because I agreed with every word he said, but because he didn't let them drag him down to their level. He stood there, with coffee on his coat, and dignity in his bones. He gave them no tantrum, no tweet storm, no meltdown, just silence, and a smile. I don't know about you, but to me that's not weakness. That's what strength looks like when it's done proving itself. He should have left. Any normal man humiliated on camera, coffee staining his coat dismissed without a handshake, would have just turned around, walked out the same door he wasn't supposed to walk in through. But Trump didn't move. He stood beside the podium, looked at the host who dismissed him, then slowly turned back toward the audience, and smiled again. This time it wasn't tight, it wasn't forced, it was gentle. And I mean that. Gentle? There was a softness in that moment that no camera captured, no blog tweeted, no late-night monologue recycled for easy clicks. He looked out over that crowd filled with people who had cheered for his fall, who had written his obituary 100 times, and instead of attacking, he gave them a moment of grace. "I'll step aside," he said quietly. "This isn't my stage, never was. But before I go, I want to say one last thing. Not about me, about you." The room froze. Even Colbert. Trump raised his hand not in anger, but as if calming a room of children about to interrupt. "You've spent years mocking me. That's your right. You've said I'm crude, rude, dangerous, stupid. Fine, I've heard it all." He paused. "But have you ever asked why I never stopped showing up?" No one answered. He didn't wait for them to. "Because I wasn't showing up for you," he said. "I was showing up for the people who don't get into rooms like this, who don't know the jokes, who don't wear the tux, who work double shifts and still get called ignorant for caring about their country." A few heads turned. A few pens stopped writing. And I'll be honest with you, I felt something shift in me too. Because we've all been in a room where we didn't understand the language, the references, the tone, where everyone else knew when to laugh. And we didn't. Trump wasn't asking for pity. He wasn't even asking to be liked. He was saying, "I know I don't belong here, but maybe you don't belong where you think you do either." That's when the air got thick. Not heavy. Still, like the moment before thunder. When nature leans forward. Colbert leaned forward too, lips parting slightly, waiting. But Trump didn't attack him. Instead, he looked at Colbert and said, "You once said I fear books. Maybe you're right. But I wonder, do you fear a man who can't be scripted?" That line didn't explode. It echoed, because it wasn't said for the cameras. It was said for them. And for us. And suddenly the power dynamic, this carefully choreographed pageant of who belongs and who doesn't, wasn't so clear anymore. Not because Trump had proven he was better, but because he refused to play the part they wrote for him. And that right there is the twist I didn't see coming. He didn't fight back. He didn't win the room in the way political scripts are supposed to demand. He unraveled it. He made the jokes fall flat by not being what they expected. And it worked. How do I know? Because Colbert Stephen freaking Colbert lowered his hand from his mouth and didn't say a word. Not a quip, not a jab, nothing. He just stared. Trump nodded once more, that's all, and turned. Not to applause, but to silence. The good kind. The rare kind. The kind that says we weren't ready for that. And maybe we needed it. He stepped down. No one clapped. No cameras flashed. No dramatic music swelled. Just the shuffle of a chair leg on carpet, the faint tapping of a wine glass being nervously set down, the mechanical breath of a telephoto lens no longer snapping. And in that silence, something ancient moved. I don't mean that in a mystical way. I mean it in the kind of way you feel when the weight of a moment outgrows the room that tried to contain it. He didn't storm out, didn't hang around for the salad course. He simply walked the same way he came in, quiet, direct, unescorted. And maybe that's the part that stuck with me the most. 'Cause we're so used to outrage, aren't we? We're trained to expect the spectacle, the rebuttal, the tweet, the final dagger that trends by midnight. But this man they'd mocked for years chose the quietest revenge of all, not giving them one. I've thought a lot about that walk. The way he didn't rush, the way his back stayed straight, the way not a single person reached out, not to stop him, not to shake his hand, not even to throw one last insult while his back was turned. No one. Because in that moment, I think even the harshest critics knew they had watched something they didn't have a category for. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't claimed martyrdom. He hadn't tried to rewrite the headlines. He just walked out with dignity. The kind of dignity you don't get from polls or press coverage, but from surviving something soul-bruising and not letting it make you small. And as he reached the exit, something remarkable happened. The same waiter from before, the one who had spilled the coffee, stood near the coat rack. Trump didn't flinch when their eyes met, and the waiter blinked, then nodded. Not an apology, but something real. A pause, a recognition. Because sometimes even the people paid to sneer at you can't help but see the line you refuse to cross. Trump picked up his coat. It was still wet. The coffee stain had spread slightly across the shoulder. He slipped it on anyway. No theatrics, no effort to conceal it. Because maybe that was the point. He wasn't there to look clean. He was there to stand firm. And I think some part of that room, some part of every room, like it knew, even if they'd never admit it out loud, that they'd just witnessed something raw and rare. Not political power, not rhetorical genius, but restraint. I'll never forget that. Because in a culture built to reward fury, the man most expected to explode refused. And I can't help but wonder, what does that do to a person when the punchline they wrote for you stops being funny? What happens when the room that once cheered your collapse now sits in uncomfortable silence, realizing they might have misunderstood the story? 'Cause that's what I felt sitting at home watching through a screen, like millions of others. A story that wasn't about politics anymore. It was about posture, about principle, about what you choose when no one gives you the benefit of the doubt. Trump could have lashed out. Instead, he let the silence speak. And it said more than 1,000 monologues ever could. You could feel it long before anyone moved. The stillness that followed his exit wasn't just awkward, it was alive. Like the moment before a storm decides whether to break or blow past. And for once, no one rushed to fill it. The jazz trio at the back looked at one another. Fingers hovered over strings and keys, but didn't dare begin. Even they knew any sound would feel dishonest. Stephen Colbert was still seated, one leg crossed over the other fingers, gently tapping his knee. But the smirk that usually accompanied his silence had vanished. In its place was something else. Not regret, not admiration. Maybe discomfort. Maybe recognition. I watched him closely. The cameras didn't, but I did. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a card. Probably his next set of jokes, and slid it back in without reading a word. Because something had shifted. Not because Trump had won the room, This wasn't a battle that ended with applause. This was a confrontation that revealed something harder to ignore, a man who walked through fire and didn't bark about the burns. And here's the moment that sealed it. Ray Bartlett, the old reporter who'd written Trump that personal letter, stood up. Quietly, deliberately. Ray was in his 80s. Had to lean a bit when he moved. No one expected him to do anything except maybe fall asleep between courses. But he stood. He raised his glass, not high, not dramatic, just enough to be seen. And he said in that gravelly voice earned from 4 decades in press boxes and motel rooms, "You all saw the show. Now ask yourself who here tonight really walked in with power. No microphone, no amplification. But somehow it echoed. A few heads turned. A few people shifted in their chairs. And someone, bless them whoever they were, started clapping. Once, twice, then stopped. Because they realized this wasn't applause time. This was witness time. You don't cheer at a funeral. You don't laugh at a man praying. And you don't clap when someone chooses character over vengeance, not because it isn't deserved, but because it's sacred. Stephen Colbert finally moved. He stood, adjusted his tie, stepped back onto the stage, and said, "Well, that was something?" He chuckled once, but no one laughed with him. He looked out into a room that had never failed to laugh before. A room trained to follow his rhythm, and it didn't, because the rhythm had changed. That's the thing they never tell you about rooms like that. They turn fast, not with words, but with weight. You can't lead them once they've stopped following. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Stephen Colbert looked small. I don't say that to insult him. I say that because when a man stands on a stage and realizes the script no longer fits the scene, there's nothing left but honesty. And in his silence, in his pause, in his failure to deliver the punchline, he said more than any joke could. He picked up his cue cards, shuffled them, and put them down again. "Let's take a break," he muttered, and walked off stage. That was the moment. Not Trump's words, not Ray's toast, not even the coffee stain. It was the moment the entire room, the people, the cameras, the writers, the influencers saw the script rip in real time, and they had no idea what to do next. That's what happens when you treat a man like a clown long enough that you forget he can bleed. And when he doesn't cry out, you realize maybe you were the performance all along. It started small, just a single clip. A grainy video from someone's phone, shaky, a little overexposed, but real. It caught Trump's final line as he turned away from the podium, coffee stain full in frame. "You can joke all you want, but I'm still here, and I'm not laughing. America isn't either." The person filming didn't even cheer. They just whispered into their mic, "I think we just saw something." By morning, the clip had 3.2 million views. By noon, it was 10. But the real story wasn't the numbers. It was the comments. They weren't the usual firestorm of MAGA versus MSNBC. They were different, slower, personal, and most of all, honest. "I don't even like the man, but damn, he held his ground better than I ever could." This isn't about politics. This is about being spit on and standing still. I've never felt so seen by someone I thought I hated. It caught the media flat-footed. Networks scrambled. Some tried to spin it Trump hijacks gala for political stunt, but it didn't stick. Because this time the story wasn't coming from the headline writers. It was coming from us. From fathers who'd been mocked at PTA meetings for their accent. From nurses who'd walked into boardrooms and been ignored. From young men who'd lost jobs because they wouldn't play along with polite lies. From Americans who knew exactly what it meant to sit in a room where every laugh was aimed at them and still refused to fold. That was the power of the moment. Not what Trump said, but what he didn't. No outburst, no finger-pointing, no storming out. He held his line, and the rest of us, we saw ourselves in that. The next day, Colbert made no mention of it. No monologue, no clever skit. Just a generic opening and a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Because even he knew there are moments you can't outsmart. You can't out-edit truth when it comes through raw. And in households across the country, men who hadn't watched a full political speech in years were rewinding that clip. Not because they suddenly agreed with Trump on every issue, but because they recognized the code. the quiet strength of the outsider who refuses to kneel. It reminded me of something my father once said. He was a trucker, didn't finish high school, never voted until he was 47. But he told me once sitting in a diner at 3 a.m. over black coffee and burnt eggs. Son, sometimes you win just by not letting him break your walk. That night, Trump didn't win an argument. He won his walk, and we felt it. From factory floors in Ohio to back porches in West Texas, people leaned in not because he shouted louder, but because he stood quieter. He reminded America of something we'd almost forgotten. That dignity doesn't require permission. That restraint is strength in its purest form. That sometimes the most presidential thing you can do is nothing at all. He walked through a room built to humiliate him, and walked out unchanged. That kind of thing. It doesn't stay in the room. It breaks out. It breaks people open. It makes them think twice. And if you've ever sat in silence while the world laughed at you, you know exactly how it felt. 3 days later, a photo surfaced. It wasn't staged. It wasn't shared by his team. It wasn't even flattering. It showed Trump walking through the loading dock exit of the hotel that night, alone under the buzz of a dying fluorescent light. His shoulders slightly hunched, his coat still bearing the coffee stain. No entourage, no press trail. Just a single man stepping into the kind of darkness only people who've been humiliated understand. And yet there was something noble in it. Not polished, but unbreakable. The caption that went viral wasn't from a fan account. It was from a woman named Maria Langston, a server at the event. She posted it on her personal Facebook with 5 simple words. He didn't flinch, I saw. That post, it was shared over 1.8 million times. Because in a world so addicted to noise and outrage, there's something revolutionary about not flinching, about absorbing the blow and choosing deliberately not to swing back. That's not weakness. That's restraint backed by clarity. You know what it reminds me of? Old men, not the bitter ones, the wise ones, the kind who sit on porches without needing to speak because they've already buried too many arguments. The kind who've lost more than they brag about, who've been humbled by their own pride and survived the embarrassment of growing up in public. That's what Trump looked like walking out that night. Not like a candidate, like a man. And America saw it. We felt it, even if we didn't say it, even if some still won't admit it. That photo ended up framed quietly on the wall of a diner in rural Kentucky. I know because I called the owner a woman named Carla. She told me, "We don't talk politics much around here, but we all know what it means to be laughed at by people who don't know our name." That photo, it reminds us to keep walking. You can't fake that kind of reverence. You can't manufacture it in ad buys or campaign slogans. It has to be lived. That's what made that night so different. Trump didn't defeat his enemies with a line. He disarmed them with stillness. He reminded the world, and maybe himself, that the loudest victory doesn't come with fireworks. It comes when your silence says everything. The real irony. The people who tried to make him look small only succeeded in making themselves look smaller. Colbert never ran that footage. The networks clipped it, edited it, drowned it in spin. But the people, we saw it raw, and we remembered it whole, because moments like that don't need editors. They just need witnesses. And we were there. Not physically, but spiritually. Because every person who's ever been mocked for their beliefs, every worker who's ever stood outside a ballroom they were never invited into, every dad who's worn a cheap suit to a meeting and got ignored, they were all in that room. They all wore that stain, and they all walked out taller. Because that night, Donald J. Trump didn't win. He endured. And that sometimes is the greatest win of all. I've watched that moment a dozen times. Not because it's flashy, not because it proves anything, but because I need to. I need to remind myself that grace still exists in a world so addicted to revenge, that dignity hasn't died in the noise, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is nothing at all. You know what's strange? That moment, the walk, the stain, the silence, it didn't go viral because it was loud. It spread because it felt true in a way most things don't anymore. And that's rare, especially now, especially here. We live in a time where every gesture is calibrated, Every apology is staged. Every public appearance is choreographed to score points, not restore decency. But that night, it didn't feel like a move. It felt like a man. A flawed one, yes, no one denies that. But flaws don't cancel courage. And that's something we need to start remembering. Because if perfection is the only standard, none of us get to speak. We've all said the wrong thing. We've all failed to stand up when we should have. We've all flinched. But what really matters, is whether after being knocked down, you learn how to stand in silence with your head up and your pride set aside. Trump didn't lecture that night. He didn't moralize. He didn't do what so many others would have done, grab the mic and turn the moment into a viral sermon for his base. He let the insult land. He let the stain show. And he walked anyway. I keep coming back to that. Not just because it surprised me, but because it moved something I didn't know needed moving. And I think it did that for a lot of us. Because behind the politics, behind the red and blue, behind the headlines and hashtags, there are people in this country carrying quiet bruises. Men who were laid off without warning. Women who've had their voices mocked because they weren't polished enough. Young men told they weren't safe because they prayed in public. Parents who were laughed at for raising kids who still believe in church country or boundaries. And they've been told again and again that they're wrong, outdated, stupid, dangerous. But that night in that room full of teeth and silk and scripts, someone carried their story without flinching, without raising his voice. And I think we all felt it. Not as a campaign, not as a comeback, but as a confirmation that what they tried to bury still breathes. That truth doesn't need applause to be real. That dignity, even when laughed at, still leaves a mark. I've thought a lot about how history will write that evening. Most won't. The networks won't replay it. The papers won't headline it. The elites will pretend it was just another night with cheap jokes and overpriced wine. But we'll remember, because we saw it, we felt it, and we were changed. Not by politics, but by posture. Not by charisma, but by composure. Not by dominance, but by discipline. I don't know where you stand politically. And frankly, I don't care. This isn't about that. This is about seeing a man stripped of everything but his restraint, and finding in that restraint something deeply American, something worth remembering. There's a kind of power that doesn't show up on spreadsheets. You can't measure it in poll numbers or likes or airtime. It's the power of holding your center when the world wants you off balance. It's the power of restraint, the kind that comes not from training, but from having been broken before and choosing not to break others when it's your turn to strike. That night, Donald Trump had every excuse to retaliate. He had ammunition. He had an audience. He had the most powerful weapon in modern America, the spotlight. And he chose not to use it. Why does that matter? Because it reminds us that power is only noble when it chooses not to be cruel. And that's something this country is starving for. We've had too many leaders, too many celebrities, too many influencers who mistake attention for virtue and rage for strength. But real strength, quiet strength, looks different. It walks alone through a hostile room. It wears the insult without blinking. And it leaves behind a silence that makes everyone else question their part in the noise. That's what happened in that ballroom. And more importantly, that's what happened after. Because you can't unsee integrity once it stood still in front of you. You can't forget it. You can try to dismiss it, mock it, spin it. But deep down, it plants something. And that seed, that ache of recognition, is what makes nations turn. It's what makes fathers call their sons the next morning. It's what makes men who never talk politics lean over to their wives at breakfast and say, "I saw something last night that felt different." And it's what makes a generation that's been told to sit down, shut up, and comply start to whisper, "What if I don't?" Because here's the truth. People don't follow perfect men. They follow imperfect men who don't give up on what matters, who keep showing up, who let the world call them names and still say, "Here I am." That's not ego. That's legacy. And it echoes far louder than applause. I'll tell you something I haven't said aloud before. My father never voted for Donald Trump. Didn't like the bluster, didn't like the baggage. But the morning after that night, He sat across from me, drinking his coffee out of the same chipped mug he's used for 15 years, and said, "Son, I still don't like the man, but I respect what he did." He paused. "That was old school. That was man stuff." I nodded, because I knew what he meant. It wasn't about who Trump is. It was about how he stood. And I think that's what so many of us are desperate to see again. Men who can take a hit and not whimper. Leaders who can walk through enemy ground and not beg to be liked. Fathers who teach their sons how to endure, not just how to fight. And real people who remind us that grace is not a weakness. It's a choice. That's what the media missed. That's what Colbert missed. That's what the crowd missed. But it's not what America missed, because the moment Trump stepped off that stage, we remembered something they forgot. That in this country, we don't admire people for how many laughs they get at someone's expense. We admire them for how much they can take and still walk away standing tall. And if you've ever been the butt of a joke, if you've ever been written off, if you've ever had someone spill something on you and act like you were the mess, then maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't about Trump. Maybe it was about us. I want you to picture that ballroom one last time. The chandeliers, the laughter that came too easily, the silence that followed too late. The man they thought they could break, standing there with a coffee stain on his coat, and nothing left to prove. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just stood still until the room broke. Before he did, that image, it stayed with me, because we live in a country where people are getting louder, but not deeper, where everyone wants to speak, but few remember how to listen, where character gets confused with charisma and dignity gets drowned out by the next performance. But that night, it cut through all of it. It reminded us that there is still weight in stillness. There is still honor in restraint. And there is still hope for a nation if we're willing to recognize that not every battle has to be won with noise. Sometimes, the greatest victory is walking away with your soul intact. So if this story moved you, if it made you sit up a little straighter, breathe a little deeper, or remember someone who taught you how to carry yourself with quiet strength, then I ask you this. Don't let the moment vanish. Talk about it. Share it. Pass it on, not just online, but in the way you carry yourself tomorrow, in the way you let your kids see you lose with grace, in the way you stay calm when someone tries to drag you into the mud. Because stories like this, they don't come often, and when they do, they aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to anchor, to pull us back to what we know is good. Right. True. So if you believe in that, if something in this story made you feel again, then I ask one small thing. Help this story travel. Not for me, not for him, but for you, and for every person who's ever been told they don't belong in the room. If that's ever been you, then this story is about you, and you're not alone. Not anymore. Thank you for staying with me. If you felt something tonight, I hope you'll share it. And if you ever find yourself in a room like that, walk in. Stand still. And don't flinch, because the truth has a way of outlasting the laughter. Until next time.